Good afternoon. This is Kelly Callaway, and it's 4:31, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. We'll probably have a few more attendees join us as the minutes pass, but we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm hoping that we have at least one person here from every one of our nominated schools, but I know how busy everybody is. And so for that reason, we are taping this webinar so that anybody from your school who needs to see it, or from any of the nominated schools who were not able to fit today into their schedule, will be able to come back to it. Or if you just want sort of a refresher course when you start actually writing your application and want to go back and hear what we said about a certain section of the application, you can do that. Let me give you a little idea of what we're doing here. We're going to simply walk through the application section by section. And based on the, oh gosh, I'm going to say roughly 10 years, I've been working with this program, and what I've seen in applications, both successful and less successful, comes through. I'm going to give you the best advice I can for making your application as successful as possible on your first submission to USDE. One of the things that we will do as an agency is review your application and provide you with any guidance that we think USDE would provide if you had already submitted your application, and we'll talk about that review here in a few minutes. But hopefully we can make that review itself more successful by talking about the different sections. And so, like I said, we'll just work through each section. Section Part 1, these are all just your demographics, eligibility certification. On this section, you just want to make sure that you answer every single question. If you leave a question blank, USDE will send your application back to you. So make sure you've got somebody checking that before you submit it. On Part 2, you find your demographic data. And again, you just make sure, you need to make sure every question is answered. On Parts 1 and 2, you can submit those parts to TEA when you submit your application to us for review if you'd like. We will not check your answers. We don't have the information we need to check your answers and verify that they're accurate. We will check to see that you haven't skipped any, and we'll look for any kind of anomalies, like if you say you have 2 students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, but you have 97% of your students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. We'll point that out to you. There might be an error here, but we can't actually check your demographic data because we don't have that information. So the part that we're going to really focus on here today are the essays. Make no mistake, these are a series of essays. Think college essays. Each one of these sections needs to read like a carefully crafted essay entire in itself. The only thing that makes it not entire in itself is that it's part of the overall application, but each one should read as though it is a completed essay in itself. Part 3 is your first impression. This is in many ways, I think, the most important of your essays because it is, like I said, your first impression. This is where you provide a picture for the reader of your school. And that picture, let me back up just a tad. I'm gonna interrupt myself and tell you that all the tips that you see on these slides that are upcoming come from one of 2 places. One is the application itself. So much of this language, including what you see on this slide, came straight out of the application. We've just broken it down for you into bullet points because bullet points can be easier to work with than the kind of long narrative questions that USDE provides on your application. So instead of asking each one of you to break that down, we've broken it down for you. So this slide language comes straight from that application. But other slides, for example, this one, and we'll get to that in a minute, come not from the application, but from the tips sheet. I hope that you have all downloaded the application and downloaded the tips for a successful application. I don't think that's exactly what it's called, but there's a tips sheet, and that tip sheet is going to be very, very useful for you, except that we have already broken that tip sheet down as well. And so all of the information from the tip sheet, you're also going to find in these slides in bullet points, which I think many people find more convenient to use than the tip sheet. So this first narrative, your introduction to your school, needs to include the name of your school, obviously, the nature of the community and the students served. So a little description of what your community's like and what your students are like. It needs to place your school in a historical and geographical context. Where is it and what kind of history lies behind it? A lot of times we read really interesting things about the history of specific schools in this section, and that history can sometimes give us insight into how far a school has come in the area of success, or what kinds of challenges the school has had to face and overcome in order to reach the level of success that you had to reach in order to be a nominated school in Texas. This section also gives an overview, and note that word. If you printed out these slides, highlight that word, an overview of the demographics and the opportunities and challenges they provide. Do not, in this section, repeat percentages. You've given all the percentages about your population, you know, subgroup population, socioeconomic percentages, all of that information is on section 2 in the demographic information. So don't repeat those numbers. You'll be wasting words, and words are precious in these narratives. Each narrative comes with a recommended word count. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but you don't want to waste words on data that you've already submitted in section 2. So make sure that's an overview, a description of the demographics rather than details about the demographics. The narrative also includes traditions, milestones, or the history of your school. Traditions and milestones can kind of be the same thing. You know, sometimes though, they're a little bit different. A tradition is something that you may do every single year, and the kids start to look forward to it, and the community starts to look forward to them. And maybe it's a tradition that, you know, students of, 5 different students within one family have all gone through your school. And so the family understands these traditions, and they all look forward to these traditions being celebrated each and every year. Milestones would be something more like the first year you had 100% of your students passing math in the state assessment, or any other kind of milestone, some kind of major event that caused you to turn a success corner around the state assessment, or any other measure of success, because we all know that success is not measured strictly by state assessment. Your presence here at this webinar is, I'm afraid, measured almost entirely by your success on state assessment, but your application to become a blue ribbon school will not be based entirely on student assessment. These narratives are your opportunity to talk about more than just assessment scores. And so milestones can be anything, can be related to any kind of success, not just assessment success. Or history, and this is kind of an overlap from the previous slide, but like I said, sometimes learning about the history of your school can provide us with some real nice insight into your success. This is not in the application, so this is an example of one of those things that comes from the tip sheet rather than the application itself. So make sure that you're either looking at both the application and the tip sheet, or you're depending on these slides. I promise they're accurate. We worked really hard and we hone them a little bit every year, based on what we learned from the previous year's application. The educational philosophy of the school. You all have an educational philosophy. You may never have verbalized it, or you may have it printed all over the walls in the hallways of your school. But whether it's printed all over the walls or you can't actually put it into words right now off the top of your head, you have an educational philosophy. And if you don't have that educational philosophy concretized into words, I would highly recommend that you put together some of your best brains on the campus and put it into words. Think about what is it you believe in as a school, and how do you approach educating your students, and how can you put that approach into words that would share with strangers what your philosophy is toward educating your students. The narrative needs to include concrete examples. I'm going to say this about 29 times during the course of the next hour or hour and a half. I'll try not to keep you the whole 2 hours, but however long we are here together, you're going to get really sick of my saying you need concrete examples. You cannot write your narratives with just sort of vague, general ideas, hoping that the concept comes across. USDE is looking for concrete examples. You know, we can say that in general, we like our jobs, but why do you like your job? What is a specific event that occurs every day, or a specific success that you get to enjoy weekly that causes you to love your job? Think in terms of those kinds of concrete examples. And then this next part, these bullets on this specific, these sub-bullets on this bullet are also very, very important, because if you can't check off each and every one of these, USDE is going to send your application back and say, well, what about physically? You talked about how you support your students academically. You talked about how you support them culturally. How do you support them emotionally, physically, and socially? So make sure that you can, and those can be kind of combined. They don't have to be, 5 separate sentences, but make sure that you've provided concrete examples that will address each one of those sub-bullets. We all know that we're not just here for academics. You're here for the whole child, or in the case of our high schools present, the whole human. That would be true, obviously, of all of our schools, K-12. But you're here for the whole human, and that includes all of these other areas. So make sure you've got somebody who's checking these off. We have talked about how we support them, their physical development, in addition to their academic development. And then this next bullet is also very important, and also one that you're going to hear me say over and over and over again during the course of this webinar. Just giving me an example is not enough. You've got to show how that example contributes to student success. So let's say your students are really great at such and such. How does that contribute to the student success of your population as a whole? Think in terms of always asking that question and making sure that you've addressed it. I believe these are the last two for this section 3, which is, remember, your introduction, your first impression. The narrative describes special programs offered or unique school day features of your school. So special programs offered, that could be things like your chess club or your multicultural club. Unique school day features could be things like you have an altered schedule every Friday so that students can participate in some kind of community service. These are just random examples that I can remember from applications over the past several years, but you know what yours are. Think in terms of what kinds of special programs or unique school day arrangements make your school unique and special. Think in terms, when you read this essay as a whole, after you've done your first draft, ask yourself, does this narrative tell a stranger the story of our success? After reading this first essay, I should have a clear picture in my mind, and more importantly, USDE reviewers should have a clear picture in their mind of what makes your school a successful school that would have brought it to this level of recognition to become one of Texas's 26 Blue Ribbon School nominees. So our next slide is actually our first survey question. We have 9 of these during the course of this webinar. They are designed to, of course, keep you engaged, but more importantly, to make you stop and think about some specific information that will affect your narrative. So this question is, has your school ever been a Blue Ribbon School before? I know we have at least one that has been, but we may have others that are not coming to mind immediately. So Audrey, if you want to go ahead and launch that survey question. So what you see there is 10% of our participants said yes and 90% said no. That does not necessarily mean that 10% of our nominated schools have been Blue Ribbon Schools before, because I encouraged everyone to bring as many people to this webinar as you wanted. Hopefully the principal will not be the only person working on this application. And so we probably, I hope, we have several people present from each and every one of the schools that's represented. But we can see that we have a few, at least one, like I said, schools that have been a Blue Ribbon School before. For those of you who have not, this next part of the first question is beside the point. Just ignore it. But for those of you who have, you need to include in that first narrative some information about what that meant to your school. If you were a previous Blue Ribbon School winner, how was that recognition leveraged to help your school improve even more and to help your school serve its community even more? We want to hear about any changes that have occurred since the last time you were a Blue Ribbon School, especially awards that have been won, recognitions you've had, changes in curriculum instruction, school climate and culture, professional development, leadership capacity, any of those kinds of things. Think not in terms of having been honored to have been a Blue Ribbon School, which is sometimes a dead end road that our applications go down, but instead, what has changed? What did that honor mean to your school? And how did it help your school become even stronger and even more successful? Think in those terms.
Oh, okay.
Are we there?
Slides are showing.
Awesome. So I am not going to repeat everything I said regarding what you should do here if you are a previous Blue Ribbon School winner. I'm going to assume that y'all listened, even though you couldn't see the words. But when you need to go back and review, everything that I just said is here on this slide. And then let's talk for a moment about word count. You're provided with a recommended word count for each and every one of these essays. Are they going to not make you a Blue Ribbon School if you go, if your essay is 900 words instead of 800? No, you're going to be fine. That said, I would strongly encourage you to be within 50 words of the recommended word count. When TEA does our review of your applications, we will tell you if you're not within 50 words. I mean, you will know that because you can do your own word count. But we will tell you, no, you didn't hit that 800, approximately 800 word count. And occasionally I have a principal kind of push back at me on that and say, you know, I saw some other applications online that had much longer essays. Well, yes, I'm sure that's true. We're not telling you that this is some kind of hard rule. It's a recommendation, but I would encourage you to stick to it. And I'm going to talk to you as an old English teacher here for just a minute. I tend to do this every now and then because I taught English, secondary English for 22 years before coming to the agency. Almost every essay that has ever been written in the history of mankind can be improved, by reducing words, by taking out meaningless words that don't add to the overall construction of the essay, by taking out in order to and changing it to for. All kinds of ways that you can eliminate words in your essays that will make them tighter and more concise and therefore more effective. And so I strongly urge you to try to push yourself toward these word limits, not because it's some kind of disqualifier, but because the tighter and more concise and more directly your email, your narrative can address the topic, the more effective your essay is. And so take these word recommendations to heart, because your essays can become much better if you do so. So that's where we are with that. Let's talk about part 4, curriculum and instruction. This is a section that I see schools struggle with a lot. So try to listen carefully to the things that I'm going to say about this. Question 1 deals with your core curriculum. That's English, math, science, social studies. Those 4 subject areas should be covered in section 1, and only those 4 subject areas. For each one of those subject areas, you should talk about specific things. This first slide says you should talk about information about civic learning. Exactly how does your instruction help students become participating citizens of the community or the world? That's a very important part of this essay. Most schools choose to put that in the social studies section rather than dealing with it separately. But because the application doesn't specifically ask for it within the social studies section, it asks for it just generally. We're covering it first here in this first slide. But after this first slide, you need to think about each of those specific subject areas: English or Spanish language arts and reading, math, science, and social studies. For each one of those, you need to talk about how the curriculum addresses the text. In the application, it's going to call this how it addresses the learning standards. But in Texas, we know what the learning standards are. They are the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. Remember, this application is designed for all 50 states, plus a couple of territories, and so they have to use generic language. But in your application, you should specifically talk about how the curriculum addresses the text. Can't just mention the text, but how is your curriculum designed to meet the text? You need to explain, this is one that people have a lot of trouble with, how was your particular curricular approach chosen? If you use a certain kind of approach toward teaching mathematics, why? Why do you use that approach? In what way is that approach different and more effective for you and your students than some other approach might be? Not just this is what we do, but this is what we do and why we do it. You need to make sure that you explain how the students acquire foundational skills in each of those 4 subjects. Foundational skills meaning, of course, those most basic building blocks of skills. The most successful responses to this question are split into 4 or 5 paragraphs, cover each subject separately, and are written with a consistent style and approach across all the subjects. And I'm going to come back to that. This year's application actually says that each subject is covered in approximately 300 words. Previous applications have said the section is approximately 700 words long, and I apologize for not updating that slide. I will before I send you these slides. But I did notice kind of right before we started here today that this year's application suggests that you spend about 300 words on each section. But let me tell you what pitfall I see schools fall into often with this particular question. You assign your English team to to write the 300 words about English, or Spanish language arts. You assign your mathematics team to write the 300 words about math, and science to write about science, and social studies to write about social studies. And each team does a nice job because each team knows what they do and how they do it. But each team will have a slightly different approach. And if each team hasn't looked at these slides carefully or isn't participating in this webinar, then each team may have a slightly different understanding of exactly what the question is asking. Also, when we read the 4 paragraphs put together, they don't read like one big cohesive essay. And so it's perfectly fine to bring in people from each of those 4 teams, but you need to make sure that they're also working toward the same goal and have the same understanding, and that somebody has then gone through these 4 different essays and added continuity and consistency so that the 4 essays don't read like 4 separate essays, but rather like one cohesive narrative. English needs to work with math, and math needs to work with science, and science needs to work with social studies, and so on. So make sure that you're kind of focused on that. And that brings us to our next survey question. Is your school an elementary school, a middle school, a high school, or an other?
Looks like so far we have 91% elementary, 5% high school, and 5% other.
Okay, great. So the way you answer that question is going to affect your answer to the next part of this question. Question 1A is for secondary schools only. So our middle schools and our high schools need to add to the previous essay another essay that is approximately 100 words that draws clear connections between your curriculum and college and career readiness efforts. And you need to be very specific with that. That can't be built into your 4 previous subject area paragraphs. It needs to be a separate paragraph labeled 1A that is just for secondary schools, and that very specifically shows how your curriculum connects to college and career readiness. If you are a elementary school, this question is not required for you. So you can simply move on to the next question. And prior to the next question, we have one more survey question. Does your school offer pre-K for 3 or 4-year-olds?
All right, we'll close that poll in just a second. Looks like the majority, 86%, is yes.
Okay, so if your answer to that question is yes, then you've got a 1B in place of the 1A that our secondary schools have to address. You need to write an extra little essay that talks about your preschool grades and the core curriculum in those preschool classes. Does your preschool cover reading, math, science, social studies, something else? Community, civic engagement, I don't know, standing in line, whatever kinds of things your preschool focuses on need to be explained in this extra essay that is applicable to you only. You also need, and this is a very important part of this that sometimes is overlooked by schools as they're writing their narrative, how does your pre-K curriculum align to your K-3 TEKS? We know that in Texas we have pre-K guidelines as opposed to TEKS in pre-kindergarten, and we all know that those guidelines are established at the state level and they are in fact aligned to the TEKS. But USDE doesn't know that. So you can't just assume. Remember that you're not writing this application for a Texas audience. You're writing this application for a national audience. So you need to make sure you address specifically how your pre-K curriculum aligns to your K-3 curriculum. And that means what pre-K guidelines do you teach that align to what TEKS in K-3 that you also teach, which of course is all of them because you're required to. You need to also describe the impact of that early education on school readiness and success. in those K-3 grades. We all know that a strong pre-K program leads to stronger kindergarten students and students who are more ready for kindergarten. But just because we know that on a philosophical level does not mean that you can assume that people know that is true at your school. So you need to describe specifically what impact does participation in that pre-K program have on your students when they enter kindergarten and their ability to be successful in kindergarten. Question 2 in section 4 gives you an opportunity to talk about more than just English, math, science, and social studies. You get to describe your programs in fine arts, health or PE, technology, and if you offer it, languages other than English. Now you can talk about other areas as well if you have the word space, but first you have to address these 4. So anybody who teaches grade 7 or older probably teaches languages other than English. Definitely our high schools teach languages other than English. Some of our elementary schools will, but everybody teaches, because you're required to, it's part of the Texas required curriculum, fine arts, health and PE, and technology. And so this is where you describe your programs in those 3, possibly 4 areas. You're going to answer the same kinds of questions. How do you teach the TEKS in those subject areas? What is your approach? A lot of times people, applications like to talk about how these approaches are integrated into the more foundational subject areas, but they don't have to. They can talk about whatever kind of unique approach you have. I want to take a few minutes to talk about this 3rd bullet though, technology. This does not mean what kinds of technology does your school use for the purposes of instruction. This is not a place to describe your one-to-one program or your tablet program or your whiteboards. This is not what this is asking. It's asking, how do you teach computer science? How do you teach computer literacy to your kindergartners, your 5th graders, your high school students? It's not asking about your use of technology, but your programs that teach students to be technologically literate. And so that's a very important point. Again, if you printed these slides out, highlight that and make a note. We're not asking about your use of various kinds of instructional technology. We're asking about how you teach technological literacy. You include, as I said, how does each program address the TEKS. Now, these next 2 bullets are going to seem a little odd to many of you. Which grades study the subject and how often do they participate? In Texas, all grades study each of those subjects because they're required to. But that is not true nationwide. And so nationwide, you may have students who study fine arts in grade 3, but not grade 4. So you need to state specifically that your students in grades K through 5 or 6 through 7 or whatever your school serves all participate in fine arts instruction. How often they participate means how many days a week. If for most of you, it's going to be 5 days a week. If so, say so. Say that they participate daily. For some of you, it really won't be 5 days a week. Maybe they do fine arts on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and they do health on Tuesday and Thursday, or they do computer literacy on Tuesday, Thursday. That's all fine. That's your choice, but you need to address that. So make sure that you answer those questions specifically. Otherwise, USDE will send your application back and say, hey, how often do they participate? So make sure you address those things very concretely. This section gives you approximately 700 words to address those topics. Question 3 in section 4 is about your instructional methods, your interventions, and your assessments. So this is where you talk about, I'm going to give you kind of a broad overview and then we'll look at the bullet points. How do you assess your students to find out where they are and what kinds of interventions they need What are your instructional methods for whole group, for all students? What are your instructional methods for those students who are maybe on what you might refer to in your school as Tier 2 or Tier 3? What kinds of interventions do you provide? And let me just say, even though it's going to be on a slide here in a minute, that we're not just talking about interventions for struggling students, but also interventions for your more advanced students. Surely your gifted students don't have the exact same instructional methods and approach as all of your students all of the time, but instead have something uniquely designed to meet their needs. So the narrative, here's the more specifics. How does the school use a variety of assessment data to analyze and improve student performance? What kinds of assessments do you use, and how are the results from those assessments used to inform instruction and improve student learning and school performance? You can, of course, mention the state assessment, but you need to talk about other types of assessment. Do you use formative assessment? Do you use benchmarking? What kinds of other assessments? And this is very important. We need to be able to see something about more than just the state assessment. And then the second part of this, how do your teachers analyze those results and turn them around into instructional strategies? And remember, I told you I was going to say this a lot. How do those strategies improve student learning? What are the effects on student learning and student success, and therefore on overall school performance of those interventions and strategies? The narrative describes various instructional methods and interventions used to meet the diverse needs of students and to achieve instructional goals, specifically tiered instruction, differentiated instruction, problem-based learning, technology-based support. This is where you might talk about your one-to-one program or your whiteboards or your interactive technology, other kinds of approaches that you may use. And this is the big important thing that a lot of applications forget. Are those methods used for multiple performance groups, not just those students performing below grade level? This is one of my key points, not just because USCE requires it, but because I taught gifted students for 22 years and came to the agency initially in 2004 as the Director of Gifted Education. We want to see specifically information in this narrative about not just how are your struggling students helped, but how are your high-performing students helped to perform at even higher levels of achievement. Make sure that you talk about an assortment of clearly described techniques and examples of when those techniques are used. Are they used daily in every classroom? Are they used at specific times of the day? Is there a special kind of intervention session that goes on during the lunch hour or before school or on an altered school schedule for some of those students? We want to see that and know specifically when your techniques are implemented. I don't seem to have a word count on this, but you'll be able to look at the application to see what the recommended word count is. And I promise, if Audrey will help me remember, to stick in one more slide here if it's not coming up. Actually, it may be coming up with word count. So let's move on to the next survey question. Do you have performance gaps between any one subgroup and your all student group? Is there one subgroup within your all student group that is not performing at the same level as your all student group? This is a yes or no question.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. It looks like a little more of an even split on this one. 58% are yes and 42% are no.
All right, so that's awesome. If all of your subgroups are performing at the same high level as your all student group, that means you're doing some things right. And if they're not all, you're still doing some things right. But if you do have a gap of 10 or more percentage points between any one of those subgroups, make sure you address within this narrative, what are you doing to close that gap? And of course, we all know we want to close gaps up, not closing gaps down. That goes without saying, but I felt obligated to say it. What are you doing to bring that one subgroup that is performing 10 percentage points lower than your all-student group? How have you recognized that, and what are you doing to address that gap in order to bring that subgroup up to the level of success of your students as a whole? This data is going to be on your data page. That, remember, is in part 2 at the very beginning of the application. USDE will look at that and see if you have a subgroup that meets this requirement, and if so, they will look to see that you have written narrative language about how you're addressing it. So make sure that you don't leave that out. And there's my word count. The section overall is approximately 700 words or less, or 700 words long. Okay, then we move on to part 5. Part 4, remember, was about curriculum. Part 5 is about school support. I am hesitating here because I'm trying to find a way to see my questions to see if there's any I can address. Okay, so I have several that said you can't see the slides, and I assume that we've fixed that problem. Okay, so there's a question here that is a really good one that I can address before we move on. When asking about the percentage point difference between a subgroup and the general, the all students group, is this only on state assessment? Yes, that is the state assessment performance that we're talking about there. That's the performance that USDE will have data on. That's the assessment you're reporting data on in part 2. And so that's the assessment that we're looking at those percentage points on for that part of that narrative. So with that, I love it when there's a question in the middle that I can suddenly answer. So we're going to move on to section 5. And before we do, or before we talk about the first question, we have another survey question. Does your school provide a safe and positive learning environment? Audrey, you can launch this and let me know what our results are. I bet I can predict them, but you just tell me what we get anyway. Okay, we're just going to move on then.
All right.
That is what I would have predicted. Your school wouldn't be so successful that it would have been nominated as a Texas Blue Ribbon School candidate if it didn't provide a safe and positive learning environment. So that was kind of a gimme, but still I wanted you to stop and think about that, because this first question in section 5 is describing that safe and positive learning environment. Describe how the school motivates and engages students and teachers, addressing, when you think about school climate and culture, each of the following. How does the culture promote student academic growth? How does it promote student social growth? And how does it promote student emotional growth? Remember back in section 3 when I talked about the fact that you needed to deal with all 5 of those areas, not just academics? Well, here's another opportunity for you to deal with more than just academic growth. Social growth and emotional growth. Make sure you talk about all 3 of those and how that growth in all 3 of those areas is promoted through your school environment. And then you need to make sure that you talk about, and this is again one of those themes that I told you I would be coming back to repeatedly, a clear connection between that positive environment for students and for staff. Don't leave your staff out, because if your staff doesn't feel nurtured and positive and safe, then your students won't. How does that environment make the school successful? Don't just describe the environment, but make sure you describe the environment for both students and for teachers, and tell about how that environment helps to make your school a successful school, the kind of school that would be nominated as a potential blue ribbon school. This section is approximately 400 words long. Next, survey question. To what extent do volunteers and community partnerships contribute to your school's success? And you have three options. They may be worded slightly differently in Audrey's poll, but a major role in your success, a reasonable role in your success, or a minimal role in your success. This can be a kind of tricky question to answer. Maybe you don't have a quick and easy answer. You have to do a little bit of mental calculating, and if you answer wrong, it's okay, but we're just trying to focus you in on what kinds of things you might say in this next narrative.
Pretty even split. 58% say it plays a major role, and 42% say reasonable.
Okay,
Go ahead and close that up.
So think about that role, because this next question is about engaging families and the community. We want to hear about successful strategies that you use to engage family and community members for student success and school improvement. Again, remember that everything has to tie back into student success and school improvement. You can't just describe, the Founders Day parade that your school participates in every year without also describing how does that participation in that community event contribute to student success and school improvement. Make sure you give concrete examples. Another one of those themes I told you I'd be returning to over and over. You can't describe it in broad generalities. I want to have firm, concrete pictures of your community's involvement with your school. Community can be anything that is in your community. Obviously, families, your students' families are a big part of this, but you may also talk about businesses, nonprofits, institutes of higher education within your community. What kinds of partnerships do you have out there with the community that helps your school and your students be successful? And again, broken record, the connection between those activities and your student success and your school improvement. You've got about 400 words to deal with that subject. Let's look at survey question 7, the driving factor behind your school's approach to professional development. How do you determine what kinds of professional development opportunities your teachers and administrators will participate in? What's the primary goal? Addressing identified staff needs, addressing identified student needs, increasing content knowledge, a deeper understanding of the mathematics, for example, increasing pedagogical knowledge, or all of the above. And Audrey, I'm gonna warn you that these percentages may be a little different than, a little more complicated, but just let me know when we've got what we've got.
So far, we're actually at 100% all of the above.
Excellent.
We got a couple for addressing identified student needs now.
I would argue that addressing identified student needs also sort of falls in with all of the above, because you can't really address identified student needs without addressing A, C, and D. Because that's how you do that. But that is an excellent answer, because what we're looking for here is a description of your approach to professional development that shows that it is a thoughtful, carefully constructed, cohesive approach. It's not just a case of your teachers find some free workshop somewhere so they participate and they get credit, but rather something that is put together in a thoughtful, planned way that really addresses your student and staff needs, whether those needs are academic, pedagogical, whether those needs have to do with, and we see this over and over, especially in the earlier grades, a deeper understanding of how to teach mathematics so that students can really internalize that and become young mathematicians before they move on to middle school. Those kinds of things are what we want to see in your description of your professional development approach. We want to see an approach that demonstrates that the school has a thoughtful, cohesive program and that discusses its impact on the capacity of your teachers and administrators. Common mistakes I see in this narrative a common mistake is leaving out administrators. It's not just your teachers that get professional development, but also your principal and your other office staff, your assistant principal, your counselors. All of those people need, and I hope receive, meaningful and carefully planned and thought out professional development each year. And so how does that, again, recurring theme, how does that professional development impact their capacity to be successful and therefore to help students be successful? This may seem obvious because we're talking about professional development, but the narrative focuses on teachers and administrators. As I said, the most common mistake I see is you talk about teachers, sometimes beautifully, but you forget to talk about the professional development that your administrators receive. Make sure that you talk about the connection between your professional development and the teach. You're required in Texas, although USDE doesn't necessarily know this. Well, we know they know it, but you know, it's not official knowledge. You're required to teach the TEKS, and so at least some of your professional development should be directly connected to being effective in teaching those TEKS. We're about to, as an agency, roll out professional development in the newly adopted and soon to be implemented English and Spanish language arts and reading TEKS. So perhaps you've been going through not TEA's professional development on that implementation because it's not out there yet, but other people's professional development on implementing those new TEKS. I know because I helped to design it in my previous position at TEA that we also rolled out professional development in implementing the newly revised mathematics TEKS, the previously revised science TEKS, and the previously revised, not these new streamlined, but previously revised social studies TEKS. So maybe your school has participated in all of those TEA provided professional development opportunities. But even if not, it's not obviously just TEA's professional development that's highly valuable, but other opportunities as well that help your teachers understand and implement effectively those Texas essential knowledge and skills. Make sure that you talk about various activities and approaches and various sources that you get your professional development from. If you only talk about getting professional development from your regional education service center, then we're going to send your application back and say, is that it? That's your only source for professional development? So do some soul searching here and think about what other sources you use for effective professional development. Make sure you talk about various and sundry approaches, hands-on approach, teacher mentoring, visiting other classrooms or other schools, what kinds of coaching, collegial coaching, what all kinds of activities and approaches do you use? Make sure that your narrative talks about how your professional development reflects how you're addressing your unique challenges. Every school, I don't care if it's the top performing school in the state, every school has its own unique challenges in serving its student community. And your professional development should be directly linked to meeting those challenges. So address that concretely in this narrative. Make sure it talks about how it impacts your staff capacity, your student achievement, and your school improvement. That's one of those recurring themes I told you I was going to beat your head in with. Everything you describe in every one of these essays needs to be tied back to how does it help? What are the results? What are the effects of these activities on everything within your school? In this particular case, staff capacity, student achievement, and school improvement. Make sure, sorry, hit the wrong button, that this answer is approximately 400 words long. I will tell you this is one of the more challenging of all the essays to get down to that 400 words. If you address everything that I just went over in all the bullets on these particular slides, you're going to be way over 400 words before you know it, and then you're going to panic. So really think about how you can make this answer concise but still concrete, and really implement the use of a good, strong editor to help you combine thoughts and ideas and eliminate meaningless words and phrases. Survey question 8. We're still in this same section. How many people are in administrative positions in your school? This is going to strongly affect your answer to this next question. Audrey, let me know when we've got answers.
All right, looks like about 70% are at 2 to 3 and 30% are 4 to 6.
Sorry, I just had myself muted. I was responding. That's interesting. I think it's interesting that we have 0 at 7 or more. We do have a lot of small schools as reflected in your answer to this. The next question is about school leadership and the role that those administrators play in your school. This narrative needs to describe the leadership structure. In other words, do you have one principal and one principal only, and that one principal is your leadership team? Or do you have a principal and an assistant principal and a counselor? Or do you have a principal and 3 assistant principals and 4 counselors? What exactly is the structure of your leadership? And it describes the roles of those members of your leadership team. What role does your principal play? What role do your assistant principals or other leadership members play within the leadership of your school? It's very, very important that you not talk about individuals. You're talking about roles here. You're talking about the principal or the counselor or the assistant principal. We don't want to hear about Mrs. Brown and what Mrs. Brown does, but rather about what the principal does in enacting the role of leadership within your school. The USDE tips specifically use these words, and I found it a little amusing. This is not an opportunity for a memoir or a biography of the principal. I've only read one application in all the many, I would venture to say hundreds of Blue Ribbon School applications that I've read. I've read one that really did do this. It was like Mrs. Brown came to her realization that she wanted to be in public education when she was only 10 years old. That's not what this question is asking about. This question is about leadership within your school campus and how that leadership, again, recurring theme, contributes to school success. It includes examples that show how your school's leadership ensures that all of your policies, programs, relationships, and resources focus on what? Student achievement and school improvement. We want to hear about specific policies. We want to hear about specific programs. What kind of relationship does your principal have with your assistant principals, and what kind of relationships do those people have with your students and your staff members? What kinds of resources do those people provide? And most importantly, how do those things impact school improvement and student achievement? We want to see a leadership philosophy. Again, this is like we talked about in the very, very first narrative, your first impression narrative in section 3. You have an educational philosophy in your school. You may not have ever concretized it into words, but you have one, whether it's painted all over your walls or not. Well, you also have a leadership philosophy. Your principal, as the leader in your school, has established, and hopefully in conjunction with his or her team, a leadership philosophy. We are a top-down leadership. We are a bottoms-up leadership. We are teamwork leadership, and why? What is the leadership philosophy in your school? Put that into words so we can point to it. And how do you have a unified, well-functioning team of leaders? How does that team work together as a team? And in what ways does that make them highly functioning? You have approximately 400 words to cover this information in. Okay, I believe this is our last survey question. And the first part of it is not a survey that Audrey can help us with, but rather one I'm going to ask you to discuss among yourselves. I don't know if you're here as a team from your school or if you're all alone from your school. I don't know if your team is meeting together in a room to watch this webinar or if you're each at your own individual computer. But if possible, take a few minutes to discuss with your team to the single most effective strategy implemented at your school, the one aspect of your educational program that you would never change, because if you did, you would feel that you were not as successful. If you're all alone at your computer, then just grab a piece of notepaper, a notepad and a pencil, and jot down some little brainstorming ideas. See if you can get something, doesn't have to be well worded, but just something, some idea, put on paper. The single most effective strategy implemented at your school, the one aspect of your educational program that you would never change. And I'm going to give you 5 seconds, like I said, to try to do that. And now I am hoping you've all come up with something, and I'm going to ask Audrey to post our next poll question. Was that an easy activity, or was it difficult but possible, or are you just completely clueless? You don't know, you can't put your finger on what that one thing would be.
Looks like we got about 11% saying it was tricky and the rest saying it was easy.
Okay, good. That makes writing this next essay easier for you. Occasionally, I do have schools saying it was impossible because they see their whole program as integrated, and that's awesome, but it's not going to help them write this next essay. The next essay, and this is your last essay, and it is one of the most important of all the essays. It's kind of like, bookends. I told you the first essay was really, really important because it's your first impression. Well, this essay is really, really important because it's your last impression. And this last essay is what USDE often turns to post about Blue Ribbon schools. Like, this last essay is sort of your chance to share your best practice with schools across the nation so that you can show them a picture of this one really highly effective strategy that they might want to think about implementing to make their school more successful. The one most important practice, whether that practice is academic, assessment related, or social emotional, used by your school that makes it so successful. What is the one thing that you think, if you didn't implement this, you probably wouldn't be on this list, this highly exclusive list of 26 Texas Blue Ribbon School nominees? And so this is your chance to describe that one practice. You may have mentioned it. In fact, I hope you did mention it in one or more of your other essays. I hope it was mentioned briefly in your first essay. Maybe, especially if it's academic, it was mentioned somewhere in section 4 when you talk about curriculum and instruction. Maybe it was mentioned in section 5 when you talked about school climate. But now's your chance to really delve deeply into it and give us a thorough insight into that program rather than just a sentence or two. One practice. If you describe more than one, they're going to send it back and say, one practice, pick one practice. describe it in depth with thoughtful analysis that connects it what? To student outcomes, school improvement and student improvement, student performance. Always connect it back to those things. Don't leave us guessing at why this one effective strategy is important to you, but tell us specifically what effect it has on student outcomes. You've got approximately 400 words to do this in. And that brings us to the end of the application, but not quite to the end of this webinar, although I promise we will be wrapping up fairly soon. The next section of the webinar is not about specific questions because we just talked about the last specific question, but rather the overall quality of all of your narrative responses. There are certain rules that you need to follow in every single one of your narrative responses. And so we're going to go over those rules here, and I'm going to ask you to appoint one person who is responsible at your school for reading your drafted but maybe not absolutely ready to submit application to check for each and every one of these things. You don't use any individual's names. We never once hear about Mrs. Brown or Mr. Brown or Farmer Brown or any of the Browns. The narratives are all written in third person. Raise your hand. We won't see you, but raise your hand if you know what that means. I'm assuming everybody raised their hand. It means you don't say, we do such and such at Brown Cat Elementary. We believe in the success of our students, but rather Brown Cat Elementary staff believes in the success of its students, of their students. The narratives do not include names of any specific products, instructional materials, or vendors. This is very, very, very important. If you use a specific reading program that you have purchased and you think it's the greatest thing ever, that's awesome, but you can't name it within your narrative. You can describe it, but you cannot name it. Okay, we want to make sure that these narratives do not come across as any kind of promotional opportunity for any either nonprofit or for-profit educational program. So I'm going to use an example from a few years ago. Those of you who've been teaching in Texas for more than just a year or two will remember when we provided at a state level participation in a program called Think Through Math. I believe Think Through Math has a new name now and it's no longer called that. But at the time that we implemented this program statewide and all schools in the state had an opportunity to participate in Think Through Math, a lot of them did. And a lot of them found Think Through Math very effective. And a lot of blue ribbon schools might have wanted to write about implementation of Think Through Math. Well, they couldn't. They could, but they couldn't name it Think Through Math. They had to describe it as an instructional, interactive, what is the word I'm looking for? Customizable online instructional program for students in math, right? They had to describe the program, not name the program. And it didn't matter that Texas was providing the program free of charge. We did that through an RFP and an award of a contract. It wasn't exactly an endorsement. It didn't matter. You still couldn't name the program. And that same thing is true for whatever programs you implement locally. Don't name them, describe them. We will send your essay back with that guidance if you ignore it and name programs. Please don't, because we'd rather you just get it right the first time. We do have a few exceptions to this rule. And so I'm going to tell you what they are. If you've got a piece of paper and a pencil, jot them down. SAT, ACT, AP as in advanced placement, IB as an international baccalaureate. Those are exceptions. AVID is another exception. Those programs are so universally used and known and unique that there's no way to describe them. You just got to name them. And so that's five programs or products or services on my list of exceptions to this rule. And those are the only 5 that I can think of. So those 5 you can actually name. You want me to say them again? ACT, SAT, AP, IB, and AVID. Anything else that you implement as part of your program has to be described rather than named. I don't call these exceptions, but you might think of them as exceptions. Here's another couple of things that you can name. You can name the TELPath. You can name the TELPath because it's something that this state, as a state, has created and owns outright. So because we own it outright and because it's available to every school in Texas, and I think even required by every school in Texas, you can name TELPath outright. Obviously, STAR exams fall into that same category, but it's very, very important that you follow this rule or your application will simply be sent back. The last bullet on this slide is that your narratives are clearly written and easy to understand. A very easy way to make sure that they meet this criteria is to give them to somebody who knows nothing about your school and ask that smart, intelligent, I know stuff about education, but not your school person to read them and see if that person has a clear understanding of everything you've described. A lot of times it can be really, really easy to describe something in a way that you completely understand, but it doesn't come across to your reader. You understand it because you understand the ins and outs and complexities and depth of the program that you're trying to describe, but you use too much shorthand and it doesn't come across to your reader. So make use of outside readers to provide you with feedback and input to make sure that they're very, very clear and very, very easy to understand. They absolutely must be free of grammatical and mechanical errors. We strongly recommend hiring a professional copy editor. Giving your narratives, and remember, I'm an old English teacher, so I can say this, giving your narrative to the senior English teacher and asking for a proofread is not good enough. Copy editing is a highly advanced skill, a skill that requires a lot of very unique pieces of knowledge and abilities. Not every English teacher has it. In fact, I would say by far the vast majority of English teachers are not going to be strong copy editors because that's not what they do. They teach English. They teach literature. They teach understanding. They teach writing, but they don't necessarily teach copy editing. And if they do, they're probably not spending their time in the most effective way in their classrooms. So find a copy editor that does this as a profession. I know that that's challenging, especially in a lot of small towns. Try to get that service donated to you by your local college or some local business rather than paying for it out of pocket. But such people do exist, and such people are invaluable when it comes to making sure that your grammar is perfect, your commas are perfect. Those are very easy things to mess up. Your narratives cannot include any formatting. They have to be just that, narratives. No bullets, no bolding, no underlining, no italicizing. Your narrative is going to be written in Word, most likely, and then it's going to be transferred into a text document, and then it's going to be uploaded into USDE's portal. When that uploading happens, you're going to lose all that formatting, and it's going to come out as a hot mess. So just write it from the get-go without any of that formatting. You just tell yourself, no bullets. I love bullets. I use them all the time. Audrey can tell you that I'm a big fan of bullets, bulleted lists. but you can't use them in your USDE Blue Ribbon application. Everything's got to be in paragraph form. Make sure you spell out acronyms the first time they are used. In this instance, in this case, you can think of this entire application, sections 3 through 6, as one big book. So you can write out Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills in section 3, your very first narrative. You can put TEKS in parentheses. I'm holding up my hands in the shape of parentheses. I wish you could see them. And then from then on, you can just say TEKS, right? But make sure that you spell out whatever acronym it is, whether it's some kind of local thing that is unique to your campus or something that is more universal like advanced placement. Spell it out the first time you use it. Put the acronym or the initialism in parentheses, and from then on, you can use the acronym or the initialism. And that brings me to the end of my preaching. My old English teacher preaching. Let's look at the timeline. This was asked about in the questions earlier. On Friday, March 15th, your applications are due to TEA for our pre-submission review. Now, let me just take this moment to say, I know that's an awful timeline. I know that many of you are on spring break the week before that. Please don't call me the week before that and say, we can't meet this deadline because we're on spring break. I know you're on spring break, many of you. I can't help it. This is USDE's timeline, not ours. And so this is when it has to happen. You know, if you need to finish your application before you go on spring break, then do it. Make yourself a fake deadline. If you want to use spring break to put the finishing touches on your application, you've got it. But we want to see it at TEA on March 5th. That's a Friday. We promise if you meet that deadline, 5 p.m. on Friday, March 15th, we promise to have your application with its completed review back to you by the end of the day, Wednesday, March 20th. That gives you 9 days between the time you get our feedback and the time you have to submit it to USDE. So that's 9 days to incorporate all of TEA's feedback in order to make your final submission to USDE as strong as you possibly can, okay? Now, let's talk a little bit more about this Friday, March 15th deadline. You can submit earlier, but it will not be reviewed earlier. On Friday, March 15th, before Friday, March 15th, I put together a team of experts, people from our curriculum and other divisions around the agency who have strong school-level experience and many of whom have worked with the USDE Blue Ribbon School program before. I put that team together. We meet Friday morning, March 15th. We have training. The training is very similar to the training that you and I have just been through. We evaluate one application together for the purposes of calibrating our reviews to make sure that every individual reviewer, and I usually have about 7, every individual reviewer is reviewing exactly the same or as close as we can get to the way the next reviewer is reviewing, so that our reviews for you will be as consistent as possible. So even if you submit your application on Wednesday or on Thursday, it will not be reviewed before Friday, March 15th. So I encourage you to keep it as long as possible, work on it as much as possible, make it as good as you can before you submit it to us. Don't submit a rough draft to us because we won't be able to give you enough help to get that rough draft up to speed in 9 days. Submit what you consider to be your final, polished, ready to go draft, and we will let you know where it still needs a little bit of work. Like I said, we work together for several hours on that Friday to make sure we're all reviewing consistently, and then every reviewer goes off and reviews on his own. I don't have a single reviewer who doesn't spend the weekend working on reviewing your applications in order to get them all back to you by the end of the day on Wednesday. We will review your application even if it doesn't meet the deadline, but we will not promise that you will get it back by the end of the day on Wednesday. We review the applications in the order in which we receive them. So whoever's application comes in first will be reviewed first. Every application that comes in by 5 will be returned with a completed review by the end of the day on Wednesday. Every application that comes in after 5 will be reviewed and returned, but I can't promise a timeline, because we've got to do those that meet the timeline, that meet the deadline first. And then, like I said, on Friday, March 29th, your applications are due in the portal. I mentioned this in the email in which I announced this webinar. It can be really, really helpful for you to spend some time reviewing the applications of previous Blue Ribbon schools. And I believe I gave you detailed instructions in that email on how to do that. You're going to want to pick schools that are most like your own. If you're a small elementary school, you're going to want to read the applications of small elementary schools, most likely, preferably from Texas. If you're a large high school, you're probably going to want to read applications of large high schools. But reading the applications of successful schools can be really effective for you. Finally, how do you get help? You will not get any help with the portal from me. TEA does not own that portal. I can't work that. I mean, I have no control over that portal. I can't answer your questions about how the portal works. If you can't get into the portal, I can't help you get in. Everything that has anything to do with the portal, logging in, downloading your application, on the 29th, submitting your application, those questions have to go directly to USDE. So they have a help desk, they have an email address, they have an 800 number. Those questions have to go directly to them. If you do have a question that you think I can help with, like which percentage data do I use here on part 2 in my demographics, then those questions can come to me. I am kind of flying solo this year. This is the first year that we've come to this point in the Blue Ribbon School process when I haven't had an administrative assistant. I'm between administrative assistants right now. I'm hoping to have one in place by the time that March 15th date comes around. And if I do, then I will let you know who that person is, because I can assure you that my administrative assistants are always way more efficient than I am at answering questions and monitoring your progress in the application process. But without an administrative assistant, I will still try to help you in every way that I can. So you can contact me directly if you have questions. I am going to try to look at my questions one more time. Let's see if any new ones have come in. And it looks like they have not. So I'm going to urge you to send any questions that you think of after the end of this webinar. I'm pleased to tell you that I'm letting you out about 20 minutes earlier than we had scheduled. And I hope that you have found this to be useful. Don't hesitate to call us or email us if you need us, and say thank you before you leave to Audrey for keeping our technology up and running.
Kelly, I think we do have a couple that just came through. Questions.
Okay, cool.
One says, can we email and ask you about specific program names?
Sure, absolutely.
And then, if I am a 6th to 12th grade campus, do I just choose other on the application?
Choose other. You will answer all the questions that are designed for secondary, like that 1A on the very first question within part 4. right? Where it talks, you have a choice between addressing college and career readiness standards or addressing pre-K. You'll address college and career readiness standards. Anything else, Audrey?
It looks like it.
Okay, great. You guys have a wonderful evening. Thanks so much for your attendance, and good luck with your application.